In the previous module, we already did some data binding. In the profile picture component, I showed that you can declare a property with some value and bind it somewhere in the razor of the component. We used the class attribute as an example. The value of the field was changed by using a click event, and we saw that the element was automatically updated. And that is one-way data binding. Changes to the field have an effect on the element, but not the other way around. We can apply the same trick to an input element. The next step in building the benefit selector is to render a checkbox. I'm adding an input type as checkbox and bind the checked attribute to the selected property of the benefit model, which is a boolean. So note that this is not a property of the component, but of the benefit model instance. So that means when the boolean property changes value, the rendered checkbox will be updated. But when the checkbox is clicked in the browser, the property value will remain as it is. We need two-way data binding. A way to do it is to handle the event onChange in addition to the one-way data binding we already have in place. I use a lambda here so that I can call a method explicitly, passing in an object of type eventArgs together with the benefit model instance. That instance is good to have because I want to update the selected property on it. In the code behind file, I'm adding the method. ChangeEventArgs has a value property which reflects the state of the checkbox. It's true when it's checked and otherwise it's false. Value is of type object, but I can cast it to a boolean and assign it to the selected property of the benefit. Let's add a null check while we're at it. So now we have two-way data binding in place. But to make things easier, Blazor has something in store that is essentially the same as what we did just now. Instead of putting selected in the checked attribute and handling onChange explicitly, we can just say addBind equals benefit.selected. The checked attribute will still be bound correctly, and the onChange event will implicitly be handled to update the property value. And that means that the onChange event is now taken. When you try to handle it in combination with addBind, there will be an error. So addBind is ideal if all you want to do is update a value. But in this case, when the user checks the checkbox, I want to do more things than that. So I'm reverting to the old situation and correcting a small error while doing it. In addition to updating the value, if the checkbox is checked, the start date of a benefit has to be set to now and the end date to 1 year from now. To make start and end date appear, I'm adding two new columns and I'm adding an if statement to the razor. When selected is true, the start date has to be shown, and the input for the end date uses addBind. If needed, you can also pick a specific culture this input has to use, or a format string by typing bind:. There's also another interesting option here. We could do something right after a value is set. If a benefit isn't selected, I just render empty TDs. So this comes down to this. When I change the selected property in the onChange event handler of the checkbox, the dates will get their new values and the visibility of the dates will be toggled. While we're at it, let's also add the save button. We're introducing state in the component for that defaults to true. The save button is added in an extra div below the table. The disabled attribute is now bound to the new state, and we're handling onClick with a new saveClick method. Before adding the saveClick method, we first have to make sure that when the checkbox changes, the button is enabled. And when it's clicked, the Benefit API service will take care of sending everything to the API for persistence. And after that, I set Save Button Disabled to true again. Before we run, there are some small cosmetics to take care of. Add the table headers for the checkbox and start and end date. And we should put the benefit selector in a TD that spans 6 columns. Now it's that happy time again. We're going to run the application to see what we got. And you can see it all works as intended. It's also possible to hook into other events using the add-bind syntax. Let's say we want a text input for the description of the benefit. We can of course do the bind like we did with the other input. So the onChange event is handled, but that event only fires when the element loses focus. If we want the description property changed as we type, we need to handle onInput. Again, we could do this manually or use bind syntax. To use another event instead of onChange, first specify the property that has to be bound to by using add-bind-value, and then specify the event that has to be used by using add-bind-value:event. Just showing you this as an example. The benefit selector doesn't need an input for the description field, so I'm getting rid of it. Instead, I just render the description value. Now let's move on and add row highlighting support to the component in the next clip.